Hi, this is Elizabeth with MamaCanDoIt.com, and today I want to show you how to do binding, how I like to do it. So the first thing that I've already done is I have cut my front piece of this dress that I'm making, and using my pattern piece I have put in my notches for the binding, and then that's the front piece, and then this is the back piece. And here I also have put my notch in right there. Okay, so then I also have my binding piece, and you can see here, it's easier to see on this side. See my 3 notches? So I have one here, and one here. And so now the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to sew my binding piece like this across the short end like that, and I'm also going to put my front piece of my dress and the back piece of my dress inside out, and I'm going to sew across the shoulders. I'll be right back, and then I'll show you what we're going to do next. Okay, so I've got my shoulder seams sewed, and I also have the binding ends closed here. So now what we're going to do is we actually have to attach all of these marks on the binding to the marks on the neckline of the dress. So here, this is my binding, and this seam right here, I'm going to have that be on the back. So instead of using a tag on my dress, it'll be really easy for the person that is dressing my baby to know that this is the back because of the seam. And then these 2 notches here on either side, one will go on this notch here on the front. This is actually the quarter point. The quarter points is almost never on the shoulder seams. So then the other quarter point is here, one is here, and then on the binding this here, this is going to be the front, obviously, because it's opposite of the back. And so then here is my neck notch here for the front. Oh, and my neck notch for the back is right here. So now how we're going to do this is I'm actually going to turn it right side out like this, and then so my notch is on this side. So I'm actually going to start with my seam, and I'm just going to kind of put it underneath my dress just like that. And then I like to use clips on my neckline like that. You could pin it too. So here's the notch, and I'm going to line up these notches just like this and clip that right on the notch. Line up my front. I definitely find that this is my favorite way to do binding. Okay, so now, here, let me just fix that. So now what I'm doing is, geez, I can't even get it on there. So now what I'm going to do is by starting on the back, which is here where the seam is, I'm going to sew it along the whole edge of the neck hole. And when I do that, you can kind of see already that the neckline is, the binding is smaller than the neckline on the dress. So when we sew it, we're going to have to stretch the fabrics so that way, and then line them up so that way they can line up. And I'll show you what I mean on my serger. Alright, so what we're going to do is I am just going to lift up my presser foot and get it into place just like that, right before my first clip, which is in the back. That's where the seam allowance is. And then I'm going to start to sew, and I'm going to move that clip. Then, after I know that my needle has hit my fabric, I'm just going to grab a hold of the next clip right here, and I'm going to just hold it like this and make sure that I'm all lined up. And this is 3/8 of an inch of a seam allowance, and so what that really just means is that I can take off 1/8 of an inch because the seam allowance on my machine is 1/4 inch. So I'm just going to cut that 1/8 of an inch off. Now look how I'm kind of pulling at it like this, and this is keeping everything lined up nicely. When I get close to the next clip, I'm just going to take that off, adjust my fabric so I can get to the next clip, which is here, and then again, I'm just going to pull it Keep everything nice and snug. Make sure we're all lined up. Okay, so then when I get to the end, which is where this is, you can see this is where I started serging. I am just going to remove this clip here, and then I am going to line up my fabric so that I can just continue on serging even past where I started. This is using a serger, but you could definitely use a zigzag stitch for this on a regular sewing machine. Okay, so as you can see, I have my binding attached this way. So now when I turn my body pieces right side out, what we're going to have here, we just make sure that everything is attached nice and evenly, and it is. So now the next step is going to be, I'm going to show you from the back side, but I like to work from the front side. The next step is going to be to push this seam allowance in toward the binding, and then while that is being pushed there, to fold the binding over top of it. So it's like this. So if I was to feel in here, let me turn from the right side, if I was to feel in here, I can actually feel that seam allowance in there. I'll show you on my sewing machine. Okay, so I want to get my sewing machine set up to finish this binding stitch. Now you can use a double needle for this, but I'm not going to. I am actually just going to use an elastic stitch, and I'm going to make sure that my tension is set to a regular tension. Another thing that I like to do is use a walking foot for doing anything with knits, including the binding. And something else to consider is always to make sure that your bobbin is full before you start working with your binding. And then I also have taken the arm off of my machine. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our dress like this, and I like to work from the outside. So remember, what we're doing is we're going to be pushing this seam allowance in toward the binding and then pulling the binding over it. So by working on the outside like this, I'm just going to wrap it around my, actually I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to wrap it around my arm here, like where you would normally do a sleeve. Then I can reach my hand in here and I can just push my binding up toward my, I'm sorry, I can push the seam allowance up toward the binding, and then with this hand I'm just folding it inward around it. So I'm just going to do that really quick, just a quick way, just by pushing all of the binding inward like this, and then wrapping it around my arm and getting my presser foot in place, making sure that my seam allowance is in there. Now when I put my presser foot down, the thing about the presser feet is that it actually puts more tension or more pressure on your binding than what you want. If I was just to continue just to sew just like this with any presser foot, whether it's a walking foot or not, it's going to end up giving me kind of a wonky neck. So I'm going to show you a trick to keep your neckline from getting wavy. So when I sew it, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to be sewing on the binding, because I want to hold that seam allowance that we're hiding in there. I want to hold that into place. And so I'm going to actually be sewing pretty close to the edge between the binding and the dress. So probably a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch away from this edge right here. So I'm going to get started with that, and then I'll show you my trick for keeping it from getting wonky. Also, when you start, I like to start right around a side seam. Okay, so now that I've started, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to continue to go along and just with my hand underneath, pushing that seam allowance through there like that. You can see my finger kind of pushing through. And then with this hand, just tucking that binding in around it. And then here is the tricky part, but honestly it makes the best necklines. I'm just going to take my thumb, and I'm just, you can see I can lift it like that. So I'm just going to take my thumb on this side, and I'm just going to barely give it a little bit of pressure going upwards. And what that's going to do is it's going to keep the pressure from the presser foot from putting so much pressure on my binding that it makes it wavy. So let's get started. I also should mention that if you push it up too high, it will actually make it so that your needle will hit your presser foot, and you don't want to do that. Okay, so you can see here that the neckline looks amazing, but we have all of this excess thread too. We have all of this excess fabric underneath here. So if I was to turn it right side out, you would see the excess right here. So what I'm actually going to do is right around a side seam, I'm going to turn it right side out like this, and then right around a side seam, which is so like right here, or a shoulder seam, I'm just going to snip that. It's hard to do and look at the camera. And then I am going to hold it and just slowly go around the entire neckline. The nice thing about having the excess here that we're trimming off is that I don't have to worry about being so precise while I am doing the binding around the neck hole. And I feel like it goes quicker that way. Okay, so now what we have left is our binding. So here is the front, and as you can see how closely I got that stitching to this edge where the white fabric meets. But what it's really doing is it's finishing it so it really looks great, but it also is keeping that seam allowance in there into place. So back here, if you notice that it is a little bit wonky, right around here actually, I ended up going from about here to about here when I was sewing it without my finger on the presser foot, and I can definitely tell the difference on what that just, I don't know if you can see how it's kind of wavy there. That was just simply because I didn't have my thumb pushing that presser foot upward. So definitely try that, and that is my very favorite way to put binding on.